The wind in that part of Montana had a name. Not a nickname, not a folk expression, not the kind of colorful local slang that tourists find charming and put on postcards. A real name spoken with the specific gravity that people in the Coldridge Valley reserve for things that could kill you. They called it the Gray Widow, and they said it the way you might say the name of a judge who had already sentenced you, with respect, with resignation, and with the quiet understanding that argument was pointless. The Gray Widow came down from the northern peaks without apology. It did not build. It did not warn. It simply arrived, a wall of cold intelligence that moved through rock and bone alike, that found the gap between your collar and your neck like a thing with purpose, that stripped the warmth from a room through 3 inches of solid pine as casually as a man peeling an orange. Old-timers in Coldridge said you never got used to it. You only got tired of fighting it. There was a difference, they said, between a person who had lived with the Gray Widow for 20 years and a person who had merely survived it. Survivors flinched. Livers simply turned their backs and kept walking. The distinction was not philosophical. In Coldridge Valley, it was practical, the kind of knowledge that separated people who stayed from people who left after the first serious winter, who drove back down to the lower elevations in February with their trucks packed and their faces set and their understanding of themselves permanently revised. The valley selected for a particular kind of person, not tough, necessarily, not aggressive or loud, or the sort of person who advertised their resilience. The valley selected for patience, for the willingness to work with what was difficult rather than against it, for the capacity to be cold without becoming bitter, which was harder than it sounded. Mara Holt had not yet learned to do either. She stood at the back of the Coldridge County auction house on a Tuesday in early October. Her hands folded in front of her, and she watched strangers bid on the furniture of her marriage. The auction house was a converted feed barn off Route 12, its walls still faintly smelling of grain and animal warmth despite the decades of other use. The smell was not unpleasant. It was the smell of animals that had been cared for in a cold place of hay, and the particular lanolin warmth of livestock, of a building that had been used for purpose and remembered it. Folding chairs had been arranged in rough rows facing the front, where a balding man in a brown vest stood behind a podium and spoke in the rapid, rhythmic cadence of his trade, a sound like water running over stones, relentless and indifferent. Mara watched the bidding on a kitchen table. It was oak solid and heavy, the kind of table that belonged to people who intended to stay somewhere. Cress had bought it at an estate sale 2 years before their wedding had driven it home. In a borrowed truck, had set it in the kitchen of the house on Delwood Road and stood back with his hands on his hips, grinning like a man who had just solved a fundamental problem of the universe. They had eaten every meal at that table for 4 years. They had argued at it and laughed at it and sat across from each other on winter mornings with coffee cups and newspapers, and the comfortable, companionable silence of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill every moment with words. She had watched him read at that table, his head tilted forward over whatever he was reading, his coffee going cold, because he forgot about it, and she had thought, this is what it looks like, this specific configuration of a person in a room. This is what I chose. A woman in a yellow rain jacket bought it for $63. Mara watched her walk to the front sign, the slip shake the auctioneer's hand. The woman in the yellow jacket did not look back at the table. She was already thinking about where it would go in her own kitchen, how she would arrange her own chairs around it, how it would become her table, carrying forward none of the history, none of the weight of what had happened at it. That was how objects worked, Mara supposed. They did not mourn. They simply waited for the next pair of hands. She did not cry. She had spent 3 weeks crying after the hospital called 3 weeks in which grief had moved through her like weather, sudden and total, and without regard for what was reasonable. She had cried until there was a specific physical soreness behind her eyes, a dull ache that she began to associate with the act of waking up each morning. And then, one day she had woken up, and the ache was still there. But the tears were not, and she understood that she had been emptied out, and that whatever was going to happen next would happen to a person who had been fundamentally altered, stripped down to something harder and simpler and less forgiving than she had been before. Not harder in the sense of coldness, harder in the sense of density. The way wood is hard, the way stone is hard because of what has been compressed into it over time. She watched a neighbor, a man named Delacourt, who ran the hardware store on Merchant Street, who had known her and Cress for years, who had given Cress credit on 2 separate occasions when cash was short bid successfully on the blue reading chair from the living room. Delacourt caught her eye briefly, gave a small nod that was trying to be apologetic, and then looked away. She understood the nod. It said, "This is not personal. This is practical. Someone was going to buy it better me than a stranger." She understood the nod completely, and she nodded back, and she felt something harden in her chest. A slow geological process. Something cooling and setting like concrete poured into a form. The form was her. The form was the shape of what she was going to have to be now. The auctioneer's voice ran on. The bidding moved from the chair to a set of copper-bottomed pots, to a pair of wool blankets, to the small writing desk, from the spare room where Cress used to sit late at night. His papers spread around him, his head bent over the particular calculations of a man who believed always that the numbers would work out if you just found the right approach. They never had. That was perhaps the most essential thing to understand about Cressholt. Not that he had been careless or selfish or cruel, because he had been none of those things, but that he had lived in a permanent state of arithmetic optimism, always believing that the next venture, the next opportunity, the next investment would be the one that finally made the columns balance. It was a quality that had made him wonderful company and a catastrophic financial partner, and the combination of the two had been what she had fallen in love with, because she had understood the risk and chosen it anyway, which meant the consequences were not something she could be simply angry about. They were something she had to account for the way you account for any decision you made with your eyes open. The debts he had left behind were not criminal. They were not dramatic. They were simply relentless, a long, quiet list of obligations that had accumulated over years. The way water damage accumulates invisible at first, then suddenly everywhere, then suddenly structural. The house on Delwood Road had gone first sold to cover the most pressing creditors before Cress was even in the ground. The furniture and household goods followed. His truck, his tools, even the modest savings account that Mara had opened in her own name and tried to keep separate had been claimed under the joint property provisions of their marriage. A legal outcome that surprised her, despite the fact that she had known intellectually that it was possible. There was a gap between knowing something intellectually and having it happen to you a gap she had now crossed. What remained when the accounting was finally done was a wooden chest containing Cress's personal effects. His pocket watch, a paperback novel with a broken spine, 3 photographs, and a lock of hair from the dog they had owned for 2 years, before it died of old age, kept in a small envelope with nothing written on it, and a single document that no creditor had bothered to contest, because no creditor believed it was worth contesting. A deed. It was for a parcel of land located at an elevation of roughly 6,200 feet on the eastern face of a mountain the locals called Goat's Hollow. And it had come to Cress through his estranged uncle, a man of legendary stubbornness who had died without other heirs, and without apparently any awareness that leaving a person this particular piece of land was less a gift than a punchline. The deed was 2 pages of legal language and official stamps, and the signature of a county clerk who had processed it with the weary professionalism of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the things people left each other. It named the parcel. It described its boundaries in the language of metes and bounds that sounded almost poetic in its precision, the way all legal language sounds almost poetic until you understand what it actually says. What it said was this: she owned 43 acres of rock. Mara had read it twice the night after the auction, sitting on the floor of the room she was renting from a woman named Patrice, who took in boarders above her dry cleaning shop on Main Street. The room smelled of chemicals and steam, and the particular loneliness of temporary places, the smell of a space that has housed many people and retained none of them that knows. It is only ever between occupants. She had spread the deed on the floor in front of her and read it in the light of a bare overhead bulb. And what she understood from it was this: she owned 43 acres of rock and slope and exposure at an altitude where the growing season lasted approximately 8 weeks. If the weather was cooperative, which, in the Coldridge Valley, it reliably was not. She owned the worst land on the mountain, possibly the worst land in the county, quite possibly one of the more aggressively useless pieces of real estate in the state of Montana, a state that had no shortage of aggressively useless real estate to choose from. She folded the deed carefully, put it back in the chest, and went to bed. She did not sleep. She lay on her back in Patrice's spare room and stared at the ceiling and listened to the dry cleaning machinery humming through the floor beneath her. A low, steady, mechanical sound that was oddly comforting in the way that all constant sounds become comforting eventually, because constancy implies continuation, and continuation implies tomorrow. And tomorrow was all she was trying to get to right now. She thought about 43 acres on a mountain at 6,000 feet. She thought about what you could do with land like that, what the realistic options were stripped of sentiment, assessed as a balance sheet, the way Cress had always failed to assess things. You could sell it, presumably, though you would not get much. You could leave it do nothing, let it sit as an abstraction on paper, a deed in a chest, a piece of rock with her name on it. You could go there. She had not yet been there. She had never visited the land. It had not seemed relevant while Cress was alive. It was a background fact, a detail in the larger geography of their life, the kind of thing you meant to look into someday. Now it was the only thing she had which changed its status entirely. Archer Holt came to see her the next morning. He arrived at 9 o'clock, driving the large gray pickup he kept immaculately clean, a truck that said everything about him without requiring further explanation. The right make the right trim level kept just clean enough to signal prosperity without tipping into ostentation. There was a specific calculus to Archer Holt's presentation of himself, a careful management of surfaces that she had sensed without being able to articulate for the entire 6 years she had known him. He was Cress's older brother, and he had none of Cress's open-hearted impracticality and all of the Holt family's genetic disposition toward calculation. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s with a face that knew how to arrange itself into appropriate expressions. Concern when concern was called for. Generosity when generosity was useful warmth. When warmth served a purpose. He sat in Patrice's narrow front parlor and held his hat in his lap and told Mara that he had been thinking about her situation and that family took care of family and that he had spoken to his wife and they had agreed that the right thing to do, the decent thing, was to take the land off her hands. He named a figure. It was the kind of figure that sounds for one brief moment like money, until you consider what it actually represents, which in this case was slightly less than 1 month of reasonable living expenses. He said, "Let me carry this for you, Mara. It's not a place for a woman on her own. The mountain doesn't care about grief. Go back to your people in Billings. Get a fresh start. No one would think anything less of you." His eyes, as he said this, were not on her. They were directed slightly upward and to the left toward the window, toward the mountain visible in the middle distance above the town, its upper slopes already touched with the first thin whitening of early-season snow. It was not a dramatic glance, not an obvious tell. It was a minor, almost imperceptible direction of attention. The kind of thing you would not notice if you were not already paying attention to the gap between what a person was saying and what a person was thinking. Mara was paying attention. She looked at the window. Then she looked at Archer. She had known him for 6 years, the entire length of her marriage to Cress, and she had spent those 6 years being politely confused by him, unable to reconcile the careful generosity of his surface with the sensation she always had in his presence of something calculating running just beneath it, like cold water under ice. You could feel the temperature difference without being able to see the current. Now, watching his eyes on that mountain, she felt the confusion resolve into something clearer and considerably less comfortable. He wanted the land, not as a courtesy, not as a rescue. He wanted it for a reason she didn't yet understand, and he was banking on her desperation to hand it to him cheaply and quickly before she could figure out what the reason was. He was betting that grief made people careless. It was not an unreasonable bet. Grief did make people careless. It had made her careless in a dozen small ways over the past month, and she recognized the carelessness only in retrospect, only after she had been careless and felt the cost of it. But she was not going to be careless about this. Something in her chest, something she had thought grief had dissolved, some hard, specific piece of herself that she had assumed was gone along with everything else, rose up and set like iron. "I appreciate you coming, Archer," she said. She did not finish the sentence with the word "but." She didn't need to. The silence she left after "appreciate you coming" said everything. The word "but" would have said, and several things besides. It said, "I see you." It said, "I know what this is." It said, "We are done here." Archer looked at her for a moment, and his face went through a small, rapid sequence of expressions. Surprise, calculation, frustration, before it found its way back to the arranged concern it had been wearing when he came in. He was good at that recovery, she noted. The sequence happened fast, less than a second, and would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. She had been watching for it. He put his hat on. He said he hoped she would think about it. He said the offer would stand. He walked to the door and then turned back and he said, "The first serious snow hits those elevations by mid-November, Mara. Maybe earlier this year. You think on that." He said it gently, the way you might remind a child that the street was dangerous. He said it with the particular gentleness of a person who has just lost something they thought they had, and who wants to leave open the possibility of getting it back at a lower cost in the future, when the other person's situation has worsened further. The door closed behind him. She heard his truck start, the sound of the engine moving away down Main Street, and then it was gone. She sat in Patrice's front parlor for a long time after that, looking at the window and the mountain beyond it, and she thought about Archer's eyes on the slope and the specific quality of the wanting she had seen in them. And she thought there is something there, on that land, something he knows about and she does not. Something worth wanting. She thought about this for the rest of that day and all of the next morning and what she arrived at sitting at Patrice's kitchen table eating toast she didn't taste, while the dry cleaning equipment hummed through the floor beneath her feet. Was this, she had 43 acres of land that was worth almost nothing and she had no money to speak of. And she had no one who was going to help her in any meaningful sense. And winter was coming with the specific inevitability of something that had been coming every year for 10,000 years, and had never once been deterred by human inconvenience. She also had from the boarding house room on Main Street nothing. She had a view of other people's buildings, and the sound of other people's lives. And she had Patrice's careful, clinical kindness, which was genuine, and which she could not bear. Because kindness when you are at the bottom does not warm you. It only illuminates how cold you are. Kindness from a position of pity is the most specific kind of cold there is. The cold of being seen clearly and found insufficient, even by someone who means you well. She made a decision. She made it the way she made all decisions that mattered, not quickly, not dramatically, but thoroughly, turning the problem over until she had examined all its faces and accepted all its implications. Then she stopped deliberating and acted. She went to Alderman's Feed and Hardware the following morning and spent almost everything she had left on a canvas tent, a folding camp stove, a shovel, a pickaxe, a heavy iron mallet, 2 bags of dried beans, 2 bags of flour, a box of salt, and 2 boxes of wooden matches. She bought a bedroll and 3 wool blankets. She bought 2 pairs of heavy cotton work gloves, which were the only work gloves Alderman's had in her size, and she bought a coil of standard rope, and she bought a handsaw, and she bought a small battery-powered radio, because if she was going to be on a mountain alone in late October, she needed to know what the weather was doing, and information about the weather required a radio. Pete Alderman, who had known her since she'd moved to Coldridge, rang up her items without comment and wrapped the more delicate ones in paper and put everything in 2 heavy cardboard boxes. He was a quiet man by nature, a man who ran his store on the principle that people generally knew what they needed, and the job of a hardware store was to provide it without editorial comment. He did not ask what she was doing. He did not offer advice. He did when she pulled out her wallet, add a box of candles to one of the bags without charging her for them, sliding it in so smoothly that she almost didn't notice. She noticed. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. The transaction was complete. She picked up her boxes and she left. She rented a truck from the filling station on Route 7 and drove the boxes to the base of the trail that led up to Goat's Hollow. And she looked up at the mountain for a long moment. The mountain looked back at her with the perfect indifference of a thing that has been there for 30 million years and expects to be there for 30 million more, that has seen people come up its slopes and does not distinguish between the ones who stayed and the ones who didn't, because it does not keep that kind of record. She looked at it until she was done looking at it, and then she began carrying boxes up the path. The path was less a path than a memory of one, a suggestion in the vegetation, a slight compression of the scrub and gorse that implied human feet had passed this way before, though not recently and not with any particular confidence. It climbed steeply, switchbacking twice across the face of the slope, and the going was difficult enough with empty hands. With a box of supplies balanced against her chest, it was a different category of experience entirely. The first trip she moved too fast and had to stop twice to rest, her arms shaking and her breathing harder than she expected. The second trip she paced herself better. By the fourth trip she had found something like a rhythm, not comfortable, not easy, but sustainable, which was different and more important. She made 4 trips. Each one took the better part of an hour. By the time she had everything at the top, the afternoon light was going amber and long, and the gray widow was building in the north the way it always built. That slow gathering of pressure and cold that you felt before you heard it. A change in the air's texture. A dropping of temperature that had intent behind it. She stood at the top with her boxes and her supplies, and she looked at what she owned. The land was exactly as bad as its reputation had promised. 43 acres of the eastern mountain face oriented into the prevailing wind, covered in the stubborn, low-growing vegetation of high-altitude exposure gorse and heather, and the occasional twisted pine that had been bent by years of the gray widow into shapes that looked like something between suffering and resignation. The trees were not beautiful, but they had a quality she recognized and respected, the quality of things that have survived conditions they were not designed for, by adapting rather than resisting, by becoming something slightly different from what they started as, something lower and denser and more deeply rooted. The soil where it existed was thin and dark and rocky, more stone than dirt. The kind of ground that had given generations of farmers one long, clear look and then sent them back downhill. Granite bones broke through the skin of the slope in great gray shoulders and ledges, as if the mountain were shrugging through its covering of dirt, the way a person shrugs off a coat they have decided they don't need. And in the center of the plot, exactly where the deed said it was, stood the ruin of the old stone shelter. It had been once a structure of some ambition, a low building of stacked granite, rectangular in plan, built with the dry stack method that people in this part of the country had used for a century when mortar was unavailable or expensive. Someone had lived there or sheltered there or used it for the seasonal occupation of the high country. In the days before the convenience of driving up and down a mountain whenever you wanted made seasonal high country habitation seem impractical rather than reasonable. That person or those people had built with care. You could see it in the size of the corner stones, the way the larger pieces had been selected for their faces. The deliberate placement that spoke of someone who understood what they were doing. What that careful building had become was a tumble, a rough rectangle of collapsed granite blocks, some of them still stacked 2 or 3 courses high. Most of them fallen inward, the whole thing overgrown with moss and colonized by the small, desperate plants that take root wherever there is a vertical surface to cling to, wherever there is a crack or a ledge that holds a little soil, wherever the ambitions of living things find a foothold in the abandoned works of other living things. The roof was long gone, taken by gravity and frost cycles, and the patient rearrangement of weight that time performs on everything. The interior was a depression of rubble and dark soil, sheltered from nothing, open to everything. Mara stood at the edge of it and felt the gray widow build behind her, and she thought, "This is mine." The thought was not ironic. It was not despairing. It was simply factual, a statement of the situation, an acceptance of what existed, the first step in any accounting. This was hers. This wreckage on this mountain in this wind was the entirety of her material position. She could work with that, or she could not work with that. And working with it was the only option she was willing to consider. She pitched the tent in the partial lee of the ruin's eastern wall, where the remaining upright stones were tall enough to break a little of the wind. The canvas snapped and whipped in the gusts with a sound like something trapped and frantic, and she drove the stakes deep and double-staked the corners, and added a line of stones around the base, where the wind was trying to get under the edges, and when she was done, it was a tent that would survive moderate weather, and would likely not survive anything more than that. She made beans on the camp stove in the gathering dark. She ate them sitting in the tent with the flap pinned open, looking out at the mountain falling away below her. The lights of Coldridge Valley scattered in the distance like embers, warm and unreachable. The analogy struck her as she looked at them. Embers, not flames, because embers were what you had when the fire had already done its work, and what remained was the afterglow, the residual heat, the light without the source. She was not sure if she was the fire or the embers. She was not sure the distinction mattered tonight. The gray widow got into everything under the tent flap, through the weave of her sweater between her fingers in the tin cup. She ate fast and washed the cup with a little water and boiled more water for tea and pulled her blankets around her and listened to the wind try to find its way in. It was not a gentle wind. The gray widow was never gentle. But in the partial shelter of the old stone wall, it was at least directional, coming from one place rather than all places, which made it manageable in a way that open exposure was not. She thought about Cress. She thought about him the way she had been thinking about him since the hospital called, not with the full force of grief, which had already done its first and most violent work, but with a kind of bewildered inventory, a sorting through of what had been real and what had been wishful, what had been the man himself, and what had been the story she had told herself about the man. Cress had been real. His laugh had been real, the particular way he had of tilting his head back when something genuinely delighted him, as if the delight were too large to contain in a forward-facing posture. His faith in things had been real. The extravagant, impractical faith of a man who believed always that the world was basically arranged in favor of people who tried hard enough. What had not been real, or what had been real only in his own mind, was every specific plan and venture and investment that faith had generated. He had been a man of genuine warmth and genuine vision, and almost total disconnection from what things actually cost. Not ignorant of the cost, he understood money in the abstract, understood the concept of expense and obligation, but fundamentally unable to apply that understanding to his own specific projects, which always seemed from inside them like exceptions to the general rule that things cost what they cost. He had lived most of his adult life in the exception. It was a quality that had made him wonderful company and a catastrophic financial partner, and she had known this and she had chosen him. She did not blame him. You do not marry a man like Cress Holt without understanding on some level that you are choosing the warmth over the security, the story over the certainty. She had made that choice, and she had not regretted it not once, not even now on this freezing mountain with everything stripped away, because the alternative, a safe, calculated life, without his particular quality of presence in it, seemed to her still like the worse option. Safety was not automatically better than warmth. You could freeze to death in a sensible house, in a sensible life, in the sensible accumulation of the things that sensible people accumulated. She had watched it happen to people. She had watched people be very safe and very cold. She did not sleep well that first night. The cold came up through the tent floor despite the bedroll and the extra blanket, and the wind tested the stakes through the night with a methodical patience that suggested it had done this before and would do it again, and was prepared to continue indefinitely. Twice she woke to the sound of something moving in the rocks nearby. Probably a marmot. Possibly a fox. Possibly something she preferred not to specify, and both times she lay still, until she was sure it was moving away, rather than toward her, and then she lay still a while longer, because stillness had become a habit. In the weeks since Cress died, stillness is the default state of a person waiting to understand what happened next. She woke with the gray dawn and made coffee on the camp stove and sat at the entrance of the tent with the cup in both hands and watched the light come back to the world. The mountain was extraordinary in the early light. She had not fully understood that, arriving tired and late the day before, with too much to carry and too much to think about. The peaks above her were white now, fully committed to winter, and the lower slopes ran through every dying color. The dark red of the gorse, the pale yellow of the spent grass, the silver gray of the exposed rock, the occasional rust of a dead pine that had finally given up its argument with the altitude. All of it was touched by the oblique morning light into something that, if you were not actively freezing and afraid, would have been beautiful. Below the valley was still in shadow, the lights of Coldridge gone out, the town invisible, the world simplified to mountain and sky, and the sound of the wind still moving through the rocks with its constant, low, purposeful sound. She thought, I need to not die here. This was not a dramatic thought. It was an engineering problem. The tent would not hold through a serious winter storm. The camp stove would burn through her fuel supply faster than she could restock it. She needed heat, and she needed shelter. And she needed them before the first real snow hit, which, as Archer had helpfully noted, could come as early as mid-November. She had at best 6 weeks. The conventional solutions were unavailable to her. She had no money to hire anyone. She had no timber for a cabin frame. And even if she had the timber hauling it up, this trail was a logistical problem she could not solve alone. She had no skill at finish carpentry, no truck to haul materials up this path, no generator for power tools, no power tools, no power. The collapsed old stone shelter offered stone in abundance, but she could not rebuild it alone. The structural math of the thing even she could see required either mortar she didn't have, or more hands than she possessed. 4 walls and a roof was a problem with more variables than her current resources could address. She spent her first week on the mountain doing what the situation required: foraging. She walked the slopes with a tarp and a length of rope, gathering every piece of burnable material she could find. Dead branches from the twisted pines, dry heather stems, the internal structure of old bird nests, the papery bark of dead scrub which burned hot and fast, but burned. It was slow, demoralizing work. A full day's foraging yielded at best a bundle of fuel that would burn for 3 or 4 hours. The arithmetic was bad. The arithmetic was in fact disastrous if this was the available fuel supply, and that was the rate of consumption in cold weather. The gap between what she had and what she needed was not something she could close by working harder at the same approach. She needed a different approach. On the 8th day, she was working in the rubble of the old stone shelter, pulling the collapsed courses apart systematically, hoping to find old timbers buried beneath the fallen sections that might have survived the decades of exposure. It was not a well-founded hope. Timber at this altitude in this climate had a short survival window once exposed to the elements, but she was working through the possibilities in order. And this was the one she was working through now. The Gray Widow was at full force that afternoon, a physical assault that made her eyes water, and her fingers go numb inside the thin cotton work gloves she'd brought. She was moving quickly to generate the body heat that the wind was continuously stealing, and she was not thinking about anything except the next stone. She gripped the edge of a large, flat slab of granite maybe 3 feet across, dark with the moisture that had been sitting under it for a long time, and heaved. The stone lifted. She rolled it aside, and something happened. She felt it before she understood it. A sensation against her face that was different from the air around her. A pressure, a movement, a breath. She froze with her hands still braced on the granite. She leaned down toward the dark cavity the stone had covered. There was a space there, a gap between the stone that had been the slab and the stones below it. And from that gap, something was moving outward into the cold air. Warmth, not heat. Not even close to heat. But warmth, or rather the absence of the cold. A temperature that was measurably, undeniably different from the air that was currently making her eyes water and turning the exposed skin of her wrists to a specific stinging red. She felt it against her cheek, and she closed her eyes, and she held very still, the way you hold still when something fragile is happening that you don't want to disturb, that you are afraid will stop if you make a wrong movement. She breathed in the air coming from the cavity beneath the stone. It smelled of deep earth, of minerals and damp stone, and the long, dark, unvisited places underground. It smelled of cellars and caves in the spaces beneath the roots of old trees, of places that the surface world's weather had never fully reached, that existed in a kind of temporal immunity. The same temperature in January that they were in July, because they were too deep for the seasons to find them. It smelled like a secret the mountain was keeping from everyone who hadn't stopped long enough to notice. The memory came without warning, the way the most important memories always do, not summoned. Not constructed, but simply arriving already complete. Already vivid, already fully formed, the way something surfaces from deep water that has been sinking for years and then finds the current that brings it back up. She was 9 years old, sitting beside her grandmother's chair in the house in Billings, the one with the wood stove in the corner, and the braided rug in front of it, and the windows that looked out on the dry grass of the yard, where the cottonwoods stood in a line along the fence. Gran Ruth was 83 that winter, or 84. She was loose with her own age in the way of people who had stopped considering it, particularly relevant who had moved past the point where accumulating years was a source of either pride or anxiety, and had arrived at a place where years simply were like weather, like the land. She was wrapped in the gray wool blanket she kept over her knees from October to April, and she was holding a mug of chamomile tea in her spotted, capable hands. And she was talking. Gran Ruth was always talking in the low, careful way of a person who believed that words had weight and used them accordingly, who did not fill silence for the sake of filling it, but spoke when she had something worth saying, which was often and never in a hurry. She had grown up on a homestead in the high country north of Billings, the daughter of people who had come to Montana with less than nothing negative capital debt and hope in equal measure, and had stayed because the land, for all its difficulty, was the kind of place that got into you and didn't let go. That made itself part of how you understood everything else. She knew things about the land that were not in books, because no one had thought to put them there. They were in her hands and her memory, and the particular quality of attention she paid to things other people had stopped paying attention to. She said, "The earth is a patient thing, Mara, a very patient thing. All summer long the sun pours itself into the ground, into the soil, into the rock, into the deep places you can't see or reach from the surface. The earth holds that warmth, the way a stone holds heat after the fire goes out. Not the same way, not that quick, slow, slow. The way something heavy absorbs and keeps, long after the sky has gone cold and gray, long after the first snow has come and gone, and come again. The deep places are still warm, still carrying that summer inside them down, where the frost can't reach down, where the season doesn't matter." She paused and took a sip of her tea. Mara could hear the sound of it, the specific ceramic warmth of a thick mug, the way Gran Ruth's hands curved around it. "People forget this," she said. "People see the frozen ground in November, and they think the earth has gone cold all the way through, but it hasn't. The surface has gone cold the first few feet that the weather can reach. But below that," she shook her head just slightly, "the earth is keeping its warmth for itself, holding it down deep where the seasons can't take it. The earth keeps a secret summer in its bones, child. The mountain never forgets the warmth it borrowed from the sun." Mara had been 9. She had been thinking about something else, the way children do, half listening, with the part of the mind that collects without sorting, that stores without filing. The words had gone in and settled without being fully processed, the way seeds in ground that isn't quite ready, settle and wait for the conditions that will make them germinate. She had carried those words for 20 years, without knowing she was carrying them. Now, kneeling on a Montana mountain in a wind that was actively trying to kill her, she felt those seeds split open. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the dark cavity in the stone. She looked at the ruin around her, the tumbled walls, the collapsed courses, the depression in the center of the old stone shelter, where the original builders had dug down a few feet to find bedrock for their foundation. That initial excavation still visible as a rough bowl in the center of the rubble below the current grade of the slope. She looked at it, and she thought about what it meant that people had dug down here deliberately to anchor their structure. She looked at the slope behind the ruin, the way it rose steeply, and then leveled slightly into a kind of shoulder before continuing up to the next ridge. A natural geography that meant the slope accumulated debris, that the soil was deepest here. At this particular spot, that the rock beneath was older and more protected, and it had longer to absorb whatever heat the compressed geological layers of the mountain carried in their cores. She thought about what it would mean to dig, not to build on the land but into it, to use the existing depression as a starting point, to carve a room out of the slope, to use the mountain itself as the walls on 3 sides, to cover the opening with stone and soil and turf, and let the insulating mass of 20, 30, 40 feet of earth around her do what no timber cabin wall could ever do: hold the temperature. Steady, keep the cold out, not by generating heat to fight it, but by interposing so much mass between the interior and the exterior that the weather simply couldn't get through. The way a cave stays cool in summer and unfrozen in winter, not because it has a heater or an air conditioner, but because it has depth, because the mountain itself is the insulation. To not fight the mountain, to join it. She sat with this idea for a long time, the wind howling over her and through the collapsed walls around her, and she turned it around and examined it from every angle, the way you turn a stone over to see if it's solid on the other side. The obvious objections presented themselves immediately, and she walked through them in order. She was not a builder, not an engineer, not a person with any relevant training or experience. The counter to this was that she had just spent 8 days moving stone and had learned things from the stone itself that no training would have taught her. She was alone. The counter to this was that she was already alone, and aloneness was a condition she was going to have to work within regardless of what she built or didn't build. She had no money for materials. The counter to this was that she had more stone than she could move in 6 months, and the mountain itself would provide the walls and the roof and the insulation if she was willing to do the excavation. The excavation was labor, an enormous amount of labor. More labor than she had ever done, more labor than she thought her body could sustain. But labor was the one thing she had in abundance, not in terms of energy because she was already depleted, but in terms of time and desperation. And desperation was a fuel that burned very hot if you knew how to manage it. She thought everyone on this mountain builds up. They reach for height. They stack walls above the ground. They put themselves above the earth, and then spend all winter defending against the elements that attack from every direction. They treat the ground as the enemy, the frozen dead thing that pulls the heat from their floors and their feet. What if the ground was not the enemy? What if the ground was the answer? What if the mountain was not the obstacle and the cold was not the problem? and the only mistake everyone had been making for 200 years was the direction they were building. She thought about what Gran Ruth had said, the secret summer, the warmth that the earth borrowed from the sun and kept in its deep places patient and unchanged, while the world above went gray and violent with winter. She would dig. She would burrow into this mountain, and she would use its own thermal mass to keep herself alive. And if it killed her, she would at least have died trying something real, rather than freezing to death in someone else's charity while waiting for a rescue that was never going to come. She would be the fox. She would be the badger. She would be the marmot she'd heard in the rocks the first night. Some small, determined creature that understood instinctively what her grandmother had known and what everyone else had somehow forgotten when it is cold outside. You go inside. Not inside a building, inside the earth. She almost laughed, sitting there in the wind with the cold doing its best work on her exposed hands and face. The utter insanity of it. The sheer animal desperation of the plan. She could already hear how it would sound in Coldridge, the mole woman of Goat's Hollow, digging her own grave up there in the rocks. She could see Archer's face, the slow, satisfied smile of a man watching a prediction come true, watching the evidence that he had been right to call her grief-mad accumulate. "Let them," she said aloud. The wind took the words immediately. It had no interest in them. Good. They weren't for the wind. That night, for the first time since Cress died, she was not cold when she lay down. Not warm. The tent was still the tent, and the night was still the night, and the Gray Widow was still working at the canvas with its customary thoroughness. But somewhere underneath the cold, in the particular place where cold lives, when it has become so constant that you stop registering it as a sensation and begin registering it as a condition of existence, something had changed. She was thinking about the problem. She was thinking about it with a focus she had not been able to sustain for weeks. Not since the hospital. Not since the first terrible accounting of what she had lost. The problem was concrete. The problem had physics in it and geometry and the specific challenge of stone and earth and cold, and these were things she could think about without breaking things that were outside herself and therefore approachable. She had a plan. She had nothing else. But she had a plan, and a plan was the beginning of everything, which was the one thing she had never stopped believing. The first morning of digging was a revelation in every way that revelations are also humiliations. She understood that first morning that there is a very large gap between deciding to excavate a room out of a mountain and actually excavating a room out of a mountain. And that gap is composed almost entirely of the physical reality of stone. The old stone shelter's footprint was roughly 20 feet across at its widest point. The original builders had dug down approximately 3 feet to set the foundation. She could see this in the profile of the collapsed wall sections, the way the base courses sat below the current grade. Mara's plan was to extend that excavation to push back into the slope another 15 feet, creating a rectangular space about 10 feet wide and 15 feet deep going straight into the hillside. The front opening would be framed by the existing stone walls rebuilt and reinforced. The 3 remaining sides would be the earth itself, the living rock and packed soil of the mountain unbroken and solid. The roof would be the greatest challenge, but she was thinking about the roof later. Right now, she was thinking about the first stone. The first stone did not move. She worked the pickaxe into the soil around its edges for 20 minutes, chipping carefully, pulling the loosened earth away with her hands, trying to expose enough of the stone's underside to get the shovel blade underneath it for leverage. Her technique was poor. She was thinking about the stone as a thing to be conquered, pushing at it, treating it as an adversary, and the stone was responding with the indifference of something that has been in one place for a very long time and finds the concept of being moved by a person with a shovel somewhat beside the point. She heaved the shovel slip. She fell forward onto her hands, and the stone sat exactly where it had been sitting, presumably since the Pleistocene. She got up. She tried again. By the end of that first day, she had moved 4 stones and excavated approximately 4 square feet of space to a depth of 6 inches. Her hands, soft from years of office work, were raw and reddening, the skin at the base of her fingers beginning to separate into the early stages of blisters. Her back had a specific focused complaint that occupied the lower left quadrant and promised to be considerably worse by morning. She had eaten half a pot of beans that she could barely taste because her hands were shaking too much to hold the spoon steadily. She thought, "This is gonna take longer than I thought." The arithmetic was the same arithmetic it always was. She had what she needed, the gap between them. But the arithmetic of stone was different from the arithmetic of money. Money you could run out of, and when you ran out, you were done. Stone taught you something new every day if you paid attention. And paying attention was free. She did not think, "This is gonna kill me." She had already decided that option was not available. Harlan Reed came on the 9th morning. She heard the mule before she saw him. The particular shuffling, snuffling complaint of a large animal being asked to climb terrain it considers suboptimal, and the specific sound of hooves on loose stone that is different from hooves on packed dirt. She looked down the path and saw him coming up through the gorse, a man who looked like he had been made from the same material as the mountain itself, assembled from the same granite and patience and exposure to weather. He was perhaps 60, with the kind of face that the outdoors puts on people who spend decades in it. Deeply lined, specifically tanned on the prominent planes and pale in the creases. The face of a man who had squinted into 10,000 winds and accepted each one without complaint, but without enthusiasm either. He was lean in the way of men who work hard and eat practically every ounce of him accounted for and employed. He moved with the deliberate, efficient pace of someone who has learned that sustainable effort and maximum effort are different things, and that the sustainable kind is the only kind that matters over the long run. He had a mule. The mule had opinions about the trail that it was sharing openly. Harlan stopped at the edge of the ruin and looked down at what she had made. The cleared rubble she had spent the first week tossing the smaller movable pieces down the slope into the gorse where they clattered and settled. The 4 feet of exposed foundation stone she had begun to restack as retaining walls along the sides of the depression. The restacking still tentative, still learning. The pickaxe and shovel leaning against the one remaining upright course of original stone wall. The small fire she had going in an old tin bucket she'd found half buried in the debris burning the meager fuel she'd gathered that week, providing a point of warmth she could move toward when her hands went completely numb. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. It was the look of a man doing a genuine assessment, not a dismissal. The look of a person who has worked with physical things long enough to understand that there is always more information in what you see than in what you expect to see. Then he said, "Woman, what in God's name are you doing?" It wasn't quite a question. It was delivered in the flat diagnostic tone of a man who has already formed a hypothesis and is simply giving you the opportunity to confirm or deny it before he proceeds to judgment. Mara straightened up. She had been crouching over a particularly stubborn stone, and her back made a series of strong objections to the transition to vertical. She pressed a fist into the small of her back, which helped approximately nothing. "Building a house," she said. Harlan looked at the hole. He looked at her. He looked at the hole again with the specific expression of a man who is trying to reconcile what his eyes are showing him with what his common sense is telling him, and finding the two irreconcilable. He had come up here, she understood, because he had been told about her by Archer, probably, or by the general circulation of Coldridge gossip, which was thorough, if not always accurate, and he had wanted to see for himself. He was not a man who acted on what he'd been told. He was a man who went to look. "That's a foundation you've gone and wrecked," he said, looking at the collapsed walls she had been pulling apart. "What you're building there is a grave. Ground here freezes to 4 or 5 feet in a serious winter. You'll be locked in ice by December." He shook his head slowly. The head shake of a man who has seen particular varieties of human foolishness before and has learned not to be surprised by them, only by the specific forms they take in each new instance. "Archer Holt's been telling folks in town you've lost your sense. I didn't drive up here to believe him, but this..." He stopped. He looked at her hands. She hadn't thought about her hands. But now she looked at them too. The raw, split skin, the bandaging she'd improvised from strips torn from an old work shirt. The way the bandages had gone stiff and dark with a mixture of dirt and dried blood. They looked like the hands of someone who had been doing this for weeks. She had been doing this for 9 days. "This is folly," he said. And there was something different in his voice now, not contempt, but something closer to pain. The pain of a person watching someone else make a mistake that they cannot prevent. "Come down to the valley. There's people who'll help. The church can find you something. Work maybe, or a place to stay through the winter. No one who matters will think less of you for it." Mara looked at her hands for a long moment. Then she looked at Harlan Reed with the clear, level attention of a person who has made a decision and is done reconsidering it. She thought about the valley. She thought about the specific texture of that kind of help. The careful pity of it, the way it required you to accept a particular story about yourself. The story of the woman who had tried and failed and needed rescuing. And how once you accepted that story, it became the shape of everything that came after. The story defined you. It made you the person who had tried and failed, which was a kind of identity that you could not leave at the door when it stopped being convenient. She thought about Patrice's dry cleaning smell and Delacourte's apologetic nod and Archer's arranged concern with his eyes on the mountain. She thought about the warmth that had come up from the stone. "I appreciate the concern, Harlan," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely certain. "I'm staying." He looked at her for a long time. It was a look of genuine assessment, not judgment. The look of a man trying to determine the actual situation as opposed to the apparent one. He saw, she imagined a young woman who was exhausted in a specific structural way. Exhausted not in the muscles, but in the layers beneath the muscles, in the foundational places that exhaustion reaches when grief and cold and physical labor combine over time into something that goes all the way down to the bone. He saw her hands. He saw the rough square of excavation she had managed. And he saw she had worked to make sure of this, that the restacked stones along the edges were plumb. Not beautiful, not professional, but plumb. The eye of a man who has built things could see that. He sighed. It was a long, gusty exhalation that produced a visible cloud of vapor in the cold air. "Stubborn as the granite you're trying to move," he said. He unsaddled the mule's bags. He set on the ground a loaf of dense, dark bread, the kind that lasted, the kind made by someone who knew what lasting meant. A small wheel of hard cheese, a jar of pickled beets, and a wide-mouthed canteen of coffee that was still warm from the journey up. Then he unclipped something from his own belt and set that down too, a pair of heavy leather work gloves, thick-palmed, well-broken. In the kind of gloves that had done serious work and knew what serious work felt like, that had shaped themselves to the hands of a person who used them every day. He did not wait for thanks. He turned the mule and he went back down the path without another word. His back straight and his pace the same steady, deliberate pace he'd come up with. A man completing a task that he had decided needed completing and had no further feelings about. Mara looked at the food. She looked at the gloves. She sat down on a flat stone at the edge of the excavation and opened the canteen and drank the coffee and felt the warmth of it move through her. And she ate bread and cheese with the focused attention of someone who has not been eating enough. She thought about what it meant that a man who thought she was making a catastrophic mistake had nonetheless driven a mule up a mountain path to bring her food and leave his own gloves behind. It meant something specific, something about the code of conduct that the hard country selected for the understanding that your opinion about a person's choices and your obligation to that person as a neighbor were separate things and remained separate even when they pulled in opposite directions. She put on the gloves. The difference was immediate and total. The thick leather fit her hands with the authority of something that knows what it is for. She picked up the pickaxe and drove it into the soil around the next stone. And the feedback through the handle was clean and solid, instead of jarring and diffuse. And she could feel the way the force was transmitting into the ground. Could read it, adjust it, use it properly for the first time. The blisters on her palms were still there. The gloves didn't eliminate them, but they were contained, protected from worsening, and in that containment they could begin to heal. She worked until the light was gone. She moved 7 stones. It was not a lot. It was twice what she had managed the day before. That night she sealed the tent against the wind and lit one of the candles Pete Alderman had slipped into her bag, and she lay on her back with the blankets pulled to her chin and listened to the gray widow work over the mountain. She thought about the space she was making, the room that did not yet exist, but was beginning to exist in her mind with an increasing specificity. The dimensions of it, the way the earth walls would feel, the temperature she expected to find at depth, the particular quality of stillness that a room inside the ground would have. She thought about all the people who had looked at this land and seen only what it wasn't. Not farmable, not buildable, not viable, not worth anything. She thought about Gran Ruth's hands wrapped around a chamomile mug. She thought, I have the worst land on this mountain. Everyone has always said so. The land that no one wanted, the land that was a punchline, an inheritance, shaped like an insult. She thought, what if they were all wrong about what made land bad? She thought, what if the worst land has the best depth? She blew out the candle. Outside, the gray widow worked over the mountain with its old, relentless, undeviating force. The force of a thing that does not choose to be what it is, but simply is, that does not hate, and does not love, and does not pause, and does not yield. The sound of it was constant, and it was enormous, and it was in its way the sound of the world being itself without apology. Inside the tent in the dark, Mara Holt closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid. The work began to teach her things that no one could have told her. This was the first real lesson of the mountain, and it came gradually, the way all important lessons come. Not as a single revelation, but as an accumulation of small understandings that arrive one at a time and quietly rearrange the furniture of what you thought you knew. Mara had understood intellectually that moving stone from one place to another was physical labor. She had not understood until she was doing it every day in every weather that physical labor at this scale was also a kind of education, a slow and unsparing curriculum delivered by the material world to a student who had no option to drop the course. Stone, she learned, had personality. This was not a metaphor. It was an observation. Not all stone was the same stone. The smaller pieces, anything she could lift and carry with her arms alone, anything under roughly 80 pounds, which was a category she had expanded significantly over the first 2 weeks, were manageable. Frustrating but manageable, and they built her strength incrementally. The way all sustained effort builds strength by asking slightly more than you think you have, and then showing you that you had it. After all, that the limit you thought was a limit was actually a threshold. The medium stones, the ones that required the shovel blade as a lever, required something more than strength. They required understanding. You had to read them. Find the axis around which they wanted to pivot. Locate the point of imbalance that once found converted a 500-pound problem into a manageable physics equation. Getting this wrong meant dropped stones near misses, a vocabulary of bruises on her shins and forearms that arrived in new colors every morning, like an update on what she had attempted the previous day. Getting it right produced a specific, clean satisfaction that she had never felt in any office or any ledger. A satisfaction that was immediate and complete and entirely proportional to the difficulty of the thing accomplished. The great stones, the foundation slabs that the original builders had set at the corners and along the base courses of the old stone shelter stones that had not moved in a century and had made their peace with their location, were a different matter entirely. She spent 3 days on one of them. 3 full days of chipping and probing and repositioning and failure. Her hands aching inside the work gloves even through their protection. Her back developing a specific and articulate complaint that occupied the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning when she lay awake in the tent, listening to the wind and cataloging her own damage. The way you catalog inventory. This much pain here, this much fatigue there, this amount of function remaining in these specific muscles. The stone was approximately 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 18 inches thick, and it weighed what she estimated to be somewhere between impossible and more impossible, and she needed it. moved because it was sitting directly across the line of her intended back wall. And until it moved, the excavation could not go where it needed to go. On the morning of the fourth day, she found the angle. It was a question of a slight downhill slope in the ground, beneath the stone's eastern edge. A grade so subtle she had not noticed it because she had not been looking for it. She had been thinking about force rather than direction, thinking about pushing rather than about what the stone might want to do if given half a chance. Stone didn't want things in any meaningful sense, but stone had weight and weight had geometry, and the geometry of this particular stone's mass distribution meant that there was a point and an angle at which the force required to move it dropped from impossible to difficult. And the difference between those two categories was everything. She repositioned the shovel blade 3 inches to the left of where she had been putting it, drove it in deeper, and applied her weight to the handle in a direction that was less straight down and more angled slightly toward the downhill grade. The stone moved. It did not move far. It moved perhaps 4 inches, a slow, grinding rotation around its own center that settled it into a slightly different orientation, with a sound like the earth itself groaning. But 4 inches in the right direction was the entire world, because now the shovel had enough purchase to go in again. Deeper, and 4 inches became 8, and 8 became a foot. And after another 20 minutes of incremental work, the stone had pivoted far enough that she could get the pickaxe handle under the opposite end and begin rocking it. And rocking became rolling, and rolling became a slow, thunderous translation across the ground that ended with the stone settling into a position 6 feet from where it had started, exactly where she needed it to be. She stood over it, breathing hard, sweat cooling fast on her face in the mountain air. Her arms were shaking. She could feel her heartbeat in her temples and in the palms of her hands and in the muscles along the tops of her thighs. She stood over it and looked at it for a moment, this stone that had beaten her for 3 days, and then moved in 40 minutes when she found the right angle. And she thought the angle is always there. It is always there. The problem is finding it. The problem is being willing to look for it instead of pushing harder in the wrong direction. She moved to the next one. This was her life through October and into the first week of November. A life stripped to its absolute constituents, as simple and as hard as anything she had ever done. She woke with the light or slightly before it. The cold of the pre-dawn air found its way through the canvas with a thoroughness that made sleep increasingly difficult as the month progressed and the temperatures dropped. The darkness becoming something that had texture and weight, and a specific quality of chill that announced itself at the shoulders and worked inward. She made coffee on the camp stove every morning slowly. With attention, she allowed herself the warmth of the cup and the particular smell of it, and the 15 minutes of sitting still before the work began. She had learned in these weeks that the preservation of small pleasures was not self-indulgence, but a form of structural maintenance. A person who denies herself every comfort becomes a person who loses the thread of why survival matters. She could not afford to lose that thread. She ate a breakfast of fried flatbread flour and water, and salt pressed flat, and cooked in a dry pan, and then she put on the leather gloves and she went to work. The excavation deepened steadily, as she had hoped, as Gran Ruth's words had promised. The deeper she went into the slope, the warmer the ambient temperature became. The first 2 feet of soil had been frozen at the surface when she started a brittle ice-crystalled layer. that the pickaxe broke into with a sound like shattered glass that gave off a smell of cold and mineral. Below that, the soil was merely cold. Below 4 feet, it was what you would call cool, the temperature of a root cellar, the temperature of a place that received the seasons as a rumor, rather than a direct communication that knew summer and winter only as slight variations in the temperature of the groundwater that moved slowly through it. At 6 feet below grade and 8 feet into the slope, the air in the excavation had a quality she could only describe as neutral. Not warm, not cold, simply stable. A temperature that the body did not have to work to interpret, that made no demands that existed without urgency. She stood in that 6-foot hole on a bright morning in late October, her breath steaming in the air outside the excavation's rim, and she felt the air at the bottom of the hole against her face, and she understood that she had found the edge of Grand Ruth's secret summer. She understood it not as a metaphor, but as a physical reality, the boundary between the world of weather and the world of deep earth. The place where the thermal mass of the mountain had stored its accumulation of sun energy since before the last Ice Age patient, and unchanging, indifferent to what the atmosphere was doing 60 feet above. She was standing literally on the threshold of it. The knowledge was in her hands and her cheek and the soles of her feet. The dry stone walling was by this point a craft in progress. Her first attempts had been embarrassing courses that looked stable, fell apart when she leaned on them. Stones that seemed perfectly fitted were resting on single points of contact and toppled with the gentlest push. She had rebuilt sections 2 and 3 times each time, understanding a little more about the way stones mated, the way a slightly angled face locked against a slightly angled face to create friction and compression, rather than sliding the way the weight of the course above drove the course below into stability rather than apart. Stone walling without mortar worked on the principle that the forces in play were all compressive, everything pushing down and in nothing hanging or pulling. As long as you kept the forces compressive, the structure got stronger the more weight you put on it. The moment you introduced tension, it failed. This was not a metaphor, but it was also not only stone. She was almost entirely alone. Harlan Reed left things at the bottom of the path once a week with the silent consistency of a man fulfilling a commitment he had not made out loud, which was the most binding kind. A sack of potatoes one week, a wrapped parcel of smoked sausage the following week, a jar of preserved beans, green beans the kind put up in summer for winter. Use the date written on the lid in a hand that was not Harlan's, the careful round letters of a woman who had planned for a winter she did not live to see. Mara found this last one particularly hard to open, and when she did, she ate what was inside with a care that had nothing to do with hunger, and everything to do with the fact that someone's last summer effort had ended up sustaining someone else's survival. And she thought that this was either something very sad or something very beautiful. And she wasn't sure there was much difference between those two things at a sufficient distance. Harlan never came up the path himself after that first visit. He left his offerings and went back down. This was, she understood, a form of respect. The specific respect of a person who disagrees with what you are doing and acknowledges that it is yours to do, who helps without endorsing, who shows up without approving. In the Coldridge Valley, this was apparently what solidarity looked like. It was not warm. It was not enthusiastic. But it was consistent, and in a place where warmth was the scarcest resource available, consistency was worth more than warmth. Archer was not consistent. Archer was strategic. He did not come up the mountain himself after the first visit. He was too careful for direct confrontation, too attuned to how things appeared to risk the appearance of harassment. What he did instead was work the valley with the quiet, methodical patience of a man who understands that opinion is more powerful than force and takes longer to counter. She learned this on a day in the third week of October, when she came down the mountain to resupply a 2-hour descent and the necessary errands in Coldridge flour and matches, and a new file for the pickaxe blade, which had worn considerably blunter than it had started. She noticed it first in Alderman's Hardware, where Pete Alderman was busy with another customer, when she came in and stayed busy with that customer for slightly longer than the business warranted, not rudely, not coldly, just longer than necessary in a way that required her to wait at the counter longer than she would otherwise have waited, in a way that had been thought about. She noticed it again at the grocery on Merchant Street, where two women she recognized from the Methodist Church, women who had pressed her hands with genuine warmth at the boarding house 3 weeks after Cress's funeral, went quiet when she came around the end of the aisle and found other things to look at until she had made her selections and moved on. She did not confront anyone. She bought her flour and her matches and her file. She drove back to the base of the trail and loaded her pack and climbed. It was not until she was inside the half-built walls of the excavation, with the slope of the mountain solid at her back, that she let herself think about what she had felt in those averted eyes. Archer had been talking. Not to her, he was done talking to her. He had gone to the people around her, to the community she would need when things got harder. And he had told them something that required her to be the problem. She understood how he had done it. Not dramatically, not with accusation, but with the measured, reasonable concern of a responsible man. Over coffee at the diner on Route 12. In the parking lot of the hardware store. In the low register of a conversation between neighbors who share a valley and a set of winter worries. Saying, "I'm worried about that woman up on Goat's Hollow. She's not well. Grief does things to people. She's up there alone at elevation in October with no real shelter. If something happens, the county's gonna have to deal with it. If someone has to go up there and find her, that falls on all of us." He hadn't called her dangerous outright. He was too smart for that. He had simply planted the idea that she was a problem waiting to happen, and he had let the community's practical self-interest do the rest. She sat in her hole in the mountain and felt the specific cold of social isolation, which was different from the physical cold and in some ways harder. Because physical cold you could address with blankets and fire, and the knowledge that it was a condition of the world and not a judgment passed specifically on you. She thought, let him talk. She picked up the pickaxe and went back to work. 3 days later, on a gray Thursday morning when the cloud ceiling was low enough to feel like something pressing down, she found the bundle at the base of the trail. Not a sack of food this time. A coil of thick hemp rope, heavy gauge, and solid, the kind used for serious hauling for the work of moving heavy things in awkward geometries. Beside it, a length of dense hardwood about 4 feet long and 4 inches square, dry, and seasoned the specific shape and weight of a thing that had been selected for a purpose. And under the hardwood piece, held down against the wind, a square of paper torn from a grocery bag. 3 words written in the careful, deliberate hand of someone who does not write often, but writes precisely when he does for the big stones. No name, no explanation, no expression of opinion about whether what she was doing was wise or survivable. Simply, here is what you need. Apply it to the problem you are working on. Mara stood at the base of the trail for a long moment, holding the rope in her hands, feeling its weight and the roughness of the hemp through her gloves. Harlan Reed had driven a mule up this mountain to tell her she was making a catastrophic mistake. Harlan Reed had stood at the edge of her excavation and shaken his head with the sorrowful certainty of a man watching something go wrong that he cannot stop. Harlan Reed brought her food every week because he thought she was going to die on this mountain, and felt obligated to push that outcome as far into the future as he could. And now Harlan Reed had brought her exactly what she needed, without being asked, without having been up the mountain to see her work since the first visit, because he had looked at what she was doing with the eyes of a man who had spent his life working with the physical world, and he had understood without needing to be told what the limiting factor was. The big stones, the great foundation slabs she could not move with a shovel blade alone. He had seen the problem on his first visit and had gone home and found the solution and left it at the base of the trail. She coiled the rope around her shoulder. She picked up the hardwood lever. She climbed. The rope and the lever changed everything. The great foundation slabs that had been her primary adversaries. The stones that could not be moved by muscle and shovel blade. A loan that required a mechanical advantage she had not possessed became, if not easy, then possible. The lever worked on the principle she had been approaching intuitively with the shovel handle, but it worked it completely with 4 feet of dense hardwood, providing the moment arm that a shovel could not. The rope allowed her to rig a purchase around the stones. Once she had started them moving, looping it through the cavity she'd opened with the lever and pulling at an angle that her full body weight could sustain and direct. She moved 3 of the great foundation stones in the first day she had the equipment. She had moved 4 in the previous 2 weeks combined. The excavation advanced. The room grew. She dug back into the slope with a focus that had acquired a quality she hadn't expected. Not desperation anymore. Or not only desperation, but something that had developed from desperation over the weeks. Something with more shape to it. She was building. She had not been sure at the beginning that she was actually building, she had been surviving. She had been attempting. She had been moving in a direction that might or might not lead somewhere livable. Now she could see where it was going. She could see the room. She could feel the shape of it in the excavation in the walls that were rising along the sides as she rebuilt the foundation courses and extended them in the depth of the space behind the stone face, in the temperature of the air at the bottom that was stable and cool and promised stability and coolness through the worst of what was coming. She was gonna make it. Not certainly there were still the questions of the roof of the fuel supply, of 100 practical details that remained unresolved. But possibly. The possibility had solidified into something she could almost call probability. And probability was a thing you could work with. The roof was gonna be the greatest single challenge, and she had known it from the beginning, and had been thinking about it with a consistent corner of her mind the whole time. The way you keep a difficult calculation running in the background while you work on the more immediate problems in the foreground. She had no timber for beams. Bringing lumber up this trail in the quantities needed was not feasible for one person. She could not pour concrete. She could not bring any conventional roofing material up in the quantities required. What she had was stone. Stone in abundance. Stone of every dimension. Stone that the original builders had selected and placed, and that the mountain was continuing to offer up through the ongoing excavation. Stone that she knew better now than she had known any material in her life, having spent 6 weeks in close physical relationship with it. She had learned its grain, its cleavage, its weight distribution, the way it responded to percussion and to pressure, the faces that locked together and the faces that slid. She had become, by necessity and repetition, someone who understood stone. She would roof with stone, not arched stone, which required a precision of placement and a structural understanding she could not guarantee. Not corbelled stone, which required height and time she did not have. Flat stone, the large, flat-face granite slabs that appeared throughout the excavation. As she went deeper plates of rock that had formed along the geological strata of the mountain, where pressure and chemistry had created natural cleavage planes over millions of years. The stone had an inclination to split flat, and the original builders had recognized this and used it. And she was recognizing and using it in her turn. 2 centuries later, for the same reason, it was what was available, and what was available was sufficient if you were willing to work with it rather than wishing for something else. The 5 largest slabs she could find and move took a week of searching and hauling, and a particular quality of physical effort she had not previously accessed, the kind that lives on the far side of what you think you can sustain, the kind that you find only when you have no choice but to find it. Each was approximately 5 feet long and 3 feet wide, and 4 to 5 inches thick. Heavy beyond what she could lift, not beyond what she could move. She built ramps, crude constructions of smaller stone, and compacted earth rising from the ground level to the top of the side walls, at a grade that a heavy stone could be worked up incrementally, a foot at a time, the rope anchored above and the lever working below. Each ramp took the better part of a day to construct and was demolished by the stone's passage over it, which meant each slab required a new ramp. The inefficiency of this was extreme. She did not have another method. The first slab was the worst because she didn't know yet whether the plan would work. There was a moment the stone balanced at the top of the ramp, resting at an angle against the top course of the wall, not yet fully committed to either direction, when she lost the rope. She lost it for approximately 4 seconds, the hemp burning through her gloved hands faster than she could arrest it, and the stone began to tilt inward toward the excavation below, toward the space where she would have been if she had been 2 feet to the left. And she lunged and caught the rope and dug her heels into the earthen bank and pulled with everything she had, muscle and fear and the specific focused rage of a person who has worked too hard and come too far to be beaten by this particular stone at this particular moment. And the slab stopped. She held it. She repositioned her grip. She corrected the angle. She laid it flat. She sat on the ramp afterward and shook for a few minutes. Not from fear exactly. The fear had been useful in the moment and had done its job and was now receding. What was left was the physical residue of maximum effort, the trembling that muscles do when they have been asked for everything and have given it. She sat and shook, and then she got up and looked at the slab in its position, covering the first 3 feet of the opening above the excavation. And she felt something that was not triumph. Triumph implied contest, implied a winner and a loser. And the stone had no interest in winning or losing, but was something in that family, something quieter and more durable, something that belonged to her completely, because she had made it herself. The gaps between the 5 slabs were packed with smaller stone wedged and shimmed until the coverage was as complete as her materials allowed. Then a layer of the clay-heavy soil she had excavated went over the entire stone roof, packed thick and over that she laid turf cut from the slope above. Placed green side up, the roots going down into the soil, beginning slowly to knit. She built the door from the planks of the packing crates. The supplies had come in assembled with nails. She pulled from the original frame fitted with rope hinges and packed on the interior face with a layer of canvas and old rags. A rough door. Not a beautiful door. A door that sealed the opening that interrupted the wind's path, that drew a line between the world of weather and the world of earth. She hung it on a gray afternoon in the first week of November, with the gray widow building steadily in the north. And when she had hung it, she stood outside and looked at the shut door. And then she opened it and went inside. The silence was the first thing. The gray widow outside was not yet at full strength. It was present and constant, that low, purposeful sound that had been the permanent background of her life for 6 weeks. And then the door closed behind her, and the sound was gone. Not muffled, not reduced. Gone. Replaced by a quiet so complete she could hear the sound of her own breathing, the slight creak of the rope hinges settling under the door's weight, the distant and intermittent drip of moisture somewhere in the stone above. The quiet of a place that has been quiet for a long time, that has no interest in being anything else. The air was still. She held up her hand, fingers spread, and felt nothing against her skin. No movement of any kind. The gray widow, which had been stripping the warmth from her continuously for 6 weeks, was simply not present in this room. It was on the other side of a door, and 12 feet of packed earth and stone doing what it had always done. And none of it was happening here. She lit a candle. The flame rose straight. It did not bend. It did not gutter or shudder or acknowledge the existence of any air movement whatsoever. It burned with the serene vertical confidence of a flame in a room that has given up fighting the world outside and has made different arrangements. Entirely. Arrangements with the earth itself, which does not fight the weather any more than the river fights the rain. The temperature inside was what she had known it would be from the weeks of excavation. The neutral, stable cool of the earth's deep layer, warmer than the outside air by approximately 30 degrees. Cool enough to preserve food. Warm enough that the human body, properly clothed and fed, could maintain its temperature without effort. Her small stove, assembled from a salvaged metal drum she had found half buried in the gorse below the shelter, and repurposed with a length of thin pipe. Run through a chimney she had constructed in one corner of the turf roof, needed only a small fire to raise the interior to a genuinely comfortable warmth. Not a large fire. Not a roaring, consuming fire that burned through your woodpile at the rate of emergency. A small, economical fire burning the modest fuel she had accumulated over weeks, doing 5% of the work while the earth did the other 95%. She had built the bed frame from the straightest branches she could find and lashed with rope covered with the bedroll and blankets. She had built a table from a section of split pine and 2 stacks of flat stone. She had a stool, a shelf of packing crate plank laid across ledges in the earthen wall, her tin cup and tin plate, the remaining food supply beans and flour and salt, and the preserved things Harlan had been leaving, a small collection of practical reference and 3 books. It was a room, small and dark and smelling of earth and candle wax and the faint resin of the pine stacked against one wall. It was not comfortable in the way that comfortable had meant to her before. But it was shelter in the deepest possible sense, shelter that meant the body could stop defending itself for a moment, could stand down from the constant vigilance of exposure, could exist in a space that was actively structurally protective, rather than merely not immediately hostile. She sat on the stool and ate a dinner of hot beans and flatbread, and the candle burned without moving and the gray widow worked over the mountain above her. And she felt something that took her a moment to identify, because it had been so long since she'd felt it. She felt safe. Not happy happiness was a category she had put aside for later consideration. Not victorious victory was the wrong frame for what had happened here. Safe in the physical, structural sense. Safe the way the mountain's own core was safe from the weather that battered its surface. Safe with the patient, indifferent safety of the deep earth, which has never had any interest in the temperature outside. She slept 9 hours without waking, which was the longest she had slept in 3 months. The next morning, she came outside to find the sky had changed. The change was not subtle. The sky over Coldridge Valley in late autumn was usually a specific gray-blue, the gray of distance and high-altitude cold air. A gray that was somehow also luminous, that gave off light, even while appearing to absorb it. What she saw now was different in kind, not in degree. The clouds were lower and had the dense, matte texture of clouds that are carrying something that are not moving through, but gathering in place, pooling above the peaks like water collecting in a depression. The color was not the usual gray, but something older, pewter. The old-timers called it the color of old pewter. And when you saw that color in the sky over this valley, you knew without needing to hear a forecast what was behind it. She had seen it twice before in her 6 years in Coldridge. Once at 24 when the storm had dropped 4 feet of snow in 3 days. Once at 27 when a blizzard from Canada had stayed for 4 days and killed livestock in 2 townships. That was what the sky looked like now. The other thing she noticed was this. The gray widow was gone. Not weakened gone. The air was completely still in the specific way that stillness before a serious storm is complete. The held breath quality of a world that is gathering rather than resting. She went inside and turned on the battery-powered radio. The forecast was delivered in the careful, even tone of a professional who gives serious information by giving it plainly a major winter storm system moving east from the Pacific Northwest, expected to reach western Montana by Thursday evening. Duration 3 to 5 days. Projected snowfall at elevation 60 to 90 inches. Winds at mountain elevations 50 to 70 miles per hour. Sustained gusts exceeding 90. Temperatures at valley level dropping to -15, significantly colder at elevation. The forecast used the word historic. It used the phrase of the decade. She turned off the radio. She sat in her earthen room and looked at what she had built. She ran the calculations she had been trained to run, precise and without sentiment. Structural integrity. The stone and earth walls and roof were not going to move. The slab roof under compacted soil and turf supporting whatever additional weight the storm deposited was engineered by the mountain's own geometry compression weight, bearing down the force profile of Earth, working in its favor rather than against it. Wind was not relevant to it. Wind was happening in a different part of the world. Thermal performance. The Earth's stored heat was not going to fail. It was not a fire that could go out. It was not a tank that could run empty. It was the accumulated thermal history of a mountain that had been absorbing sunlight for 30 million years. And 3 to 5 days of storm at the surface was weather to it. The way a news headline is weather to the ocean floor. Fuel a week of small fires, which was more than she needed. Food adequate. She was, by every measure she could apply, going to be fine. She went down the mountain one last time before the storm arrived. She drove to Alderman's for lamp oil and stopped at the grocery for a bag of oats, and she accepted the slightly averted eyes and careful silences with the equanimity of a person who has stopped requiring other people's approval to maintain her sense of direction. She was in the checkout line when she heard Archer's name, not directly, not spoken to her, but in the low register of a conversation between the cashier and another customer. The kind of conversation that is conducted quietly, but not quietly enough. Archer had been at the diner on Route 12 that morning, the cashier said. He had been telling people she was a danger to herself. That grief had taken hold of her judgment, that someone ought to do something before the mountain did it for her. The woman behind Mara in line said, well, it was his brother's land originally. By rights, it should have stayed in the family. Mara kept her eyes on the cashier as she paid. She took her bag. She went to the door. She turned back once and looked at the two women with the expression of a person who has traveled far enough from where she started, that the view from where she stands now does not quite match what she remembers. Then she went out to the truck and drove back to the trail. She climbed the mountain one more time before the storm. The air at the top was absolutely still, that profound, held breath that the valley made before the serious weather. The sky was the color of old pewter in every direction. The peaks to the north were gone behind cloud. She stood outside her door and looked at the valley. Below, the lights beginning to come on in the early dusk. The farmhouses strung along the valley floor. Harlan Reed's property visible in the middle distance, with its smoke rising from the chimney in a perfectly vertical line, because there was no wind to disturb it. She looked at all of them down there, boarding their windows, stacking their firewood, doing what generations of people in this valley had learned to do when serious weather came. She had no criticism of any of it. The knowledge was real and earned and valuable. The problem was not that they were doing it wrong. The problem was only that what they were doing was a fight. A sustained, expensive, exhausting argument with the weather that had to be refought. Every winter, every storm with enough fuel and enough insulation and enough structural integrity in your walls to win it. And you could win it. But the winning cost everything you had. She was not gonna fight. She went inside. She pulled the door shut. She dropped the latch. The stillness settled around her immediately. She filled the pot and set it on the stove and measured in beans and salt and oats and let it simmer. She sat on the stool with the tin cup in both hands, the way Gran Ruth used to hold her chamomile mug, the warmth moving into her palms. Then the storm came back. It came back in stages the way the most serious ones always do. First, as a pressure change, a subtlety in the air that the body registered before the ears did the chest-deep frequency of something very large and very fast arriving from the north. Then, as sound building through the registers from the sub-audible vibration she felt in the soles of her feet, to the low structured roar that the mountain conducted through its stone, the wind's conversation with every exposed surface above her, translated into something she could hear and feel. But that had no purchase on the air in this room, no access to the temperature in these walls. She heard it hit the slope above her like a wall of sound. She heard it move through the rock around her, not as cold, not as draft, but as vibration. A deep trembling in the stone that said, "This is what the surface of the world is doing right now. This is what I contain. This is why depth matters." Not a shadow moved on the earthen wall. Not a thread of the blanket on the bed stirred. The room was as still as it had been. She drank her soup when it was ready. She ate slowly and with attention. Then she lay down on the bed she had built from pine branches and rope, and she pulled the blankets up, and she listened to the mountain hold. It held. For 3 days it held. The storm did not peak on the first night. This was the nature of the truly serious ones, the storms that earned names and got written into county records and got referenced by old-timers for the rest of their lives as a fixed point in time. A before and after the storm that everyone meant when they said that storm. They did not arrive at full strength and stay there. They built. They had a patience to them, an almost geological patience, as if the system had absorbed some quality of the terrain it was crossing, had learned from the mountains it was moving through the value of accumulation over immediacy. The first night was severe. The second night was of a different order entirely. The third day was something that people in the Coldridge Valley would speak of quietly for years afterward, in the specific stillness of people who have been inside something large and come out changed. Mara slept through the first night in a room that the storm could not reach. She woke twice. The first time was what she judged to be near 2 in the morning when a deep vibration moved through the stone beneath her. A shift in the frequency of what the mountain was conducting from the surface. A harmonic that had not been there when she fell asleep. She lay still for a moment assessing. The air in the room was unchanged. The temperature was the temperature it always was. No draft. No cold. She listened to the new frequency until she understood it as a quantitative change in the storm's force, rather than a qualitative change in the room's condition. And then she went back to sleep. The second time was at what she inferred was first light, reading it from the way the quality of the darkness shifted from absolute to very dark gray. The suggestion of a world above that was still conducting some small amount of dawn's light down through 6 feet of earth and stone and turf. She made coffee on the small stove with the good beans she had been rationing. She drank it slowly, the warmth of the cup in her hands, and the warmth of the small fire, and the warmth of the earth that surrounded her on 3 sides and above, combined into something she recognized as comfort. Not the performance of it, not the maintenance of morale through deliberate ritual, but the actual thing. She could hear the storm the way you hear a powerful river when you are standing on the bank 100 feet below. It present massive, continuous, and entirely in a different register from where you are. The sound the mountain conducted was not the sound of the wind, but the sound of everything. The wind was doing to the surface, the rock faces and ridge lines and exposed timber and frozen slope. A deep, structured roar that had harmonics in it, that rose and fell in waves as the system's intensity fluctuated. That was not monotonous despite its constancy, because the storm was doing things up there, rearranging the world, and the mountain was faithfully transmitting the report. She read her geology field guide. She read it carefully, finding in its descriptions of the mountain's composition, the granite intrusions, the metamorphic base layers, the thermal properties of the different rock types at different depths, the scientific vocabulary for what she had discovered by kneeling in the wind and pressing her cheek to a stone. The knowledge was old and wide. Her grandmother had had a version of it. The people who had built the original stone shelter had had a version of it, or at least an intuition of it they had built in this particular spot on this particular slope for reasons that their accumulated experience had taught them. Even if they could not have explained the physics, she had not invented anything. She had remembered something. On the second day, she rationed the reading. The storm had found its full voice by then. Even through the earth and stone, it was conducting a frequency that had moved out of the deep registers and into something higher, something that had an edge to it, a quality that was not quite sound and not quite pressure, but some combination of the two that she felt in her sinuses and in the bones behind her ears. She understood that what was happening above her was in a different category from what had happened the first night, and she understood it calmly from within a structure that was genuinely adequate to it. She thought about Harlan Reed's farm a mile down the valley floor. She thought about the farmhouse she had seen from the trail on clear days. Solid two-story timber frame, 30 years old, well-built and well-maintained. The kind of house that represented real investment and real craft. She thought about its west-facing wall, which was its exposure face, which was the face the storm was hitting with everything it had. She thought about what sustained 70-mile-per-hour wind did to timber construction, the way it found the joints, the way temperature differentials drove condensation into every gap, the way a structure built to resist weather, rather than to be insulated from it, became a continuous argument between material and force. An argument you won as long as the material held and began to lose the moment anything gave. She thought he is burning through his wood. She thought about this for a while, and then she set it aside because thinking about problems you cannot address from where you are is a form of punishment, and she had learned to be precise about which problems she could address and which ones she could not. Not yet. Not from here. She heated soup. She ate. In the afternoon, she slept again, a deep, genuine sleep, the kind the body takes when it is warm and safe and has accumulated a debt of rest. On the morning of the third day, she opened the door. She opened it 3 inches and looked through the gap at what the world had become. And what it had become was white, a total, absolute white. That was not static but moving, the surface of the snow being continuously reshaped by the wind, which was still working at something approaching its peak force. She needed information. Was the roof holding? Were the drainage gaps in the front wall functioning? How much had accumulated? She put on every layer she owned and pushed the door open. The cold hit her face like something physical. Not the mountain cold she had learned to work within, the cold that was unpleasant and constant, but specific and manageable. This was a different category. This was the cold of a system at full development, a temperature that converted exposed skin to a problem in less than 2 minutes. She moved quickly. She pushed through the drift that had built against the door. It came to her waist, dense and wind-packed, and turned to look at the roof. The turf was there. Beneath the fresh snow, she could see the slight unevenness of the slab configuration, the subtle distribution of load that told her the structure was doing what it was meant to do. The drainage gaps she had left in the lower front wall courses were clear on the east side and partially blocked on the west. She dug them clear with her gloved hands. She looked toward the valley. She could not see it. The world ended 40 feet below her in a wall of moving white. She went back inside and shut the door. She made tea and sat with it on the stool. And she let herself think about Harlan Reed's woodpile now, because the calculation had changed. 3 days of historic storm against a supply built for a normal winter. The arithmetic was not in Harlan's favor. She sat with this for a long time, listening to the storm give back what it had taken from the frequency. Above her, the dropping of certain harmonics, the slight softening of the roar's upper registers. The storm was still very much occurring, but something at its edge was different. The way the edge of a wave is different when it has reached its furthest point and is beginning to recede. She lay still and listened to the mountain until she was certain the peak had passed. She waited. This was the hardest thing she had done on this mountain, harder in its way than moving the great foundation stones. Waiting required a kind of active stillness that physical labor does not. A sustained decision not to move when everything in you wanted to move, to hold yourself in place, while the situation resolved itself to the point where movement made sense. She sat on the stool, and she drank 2 cups of tea, and she listened to the frequency above her drop through the registers, and she waited for it to reach the level that said, a person out in this properly equipped and moving with purpose has a reasonable chance. It dropped to that level in what she judged was late afternoon. She dressed with the methodical thoroughness of a person who understands exactly what she is dressing against. Every layer she owned. Wool socks doubled. The leather gloves inside the wool mittens she had made from a cut-up sweater. The hat down to her eyebrows. The scarf across the lower half of her face until only her eyes were exposed. She took the rope, tied one end to the iron ring she had set in the lintel stone when she was still building, when she had been thinking about contingencies. She coiled the rest over her shoulder. She opened the door and went out into it. The wind hit her immediately, a sustained force that pushed against her chest and shoulders with physical intention. But it was not the wall it had been. It was severe and it was cold, and it had strong opinions about her being outside. But she could stand in it without staggering, and she could move against it with controlled effort. She could see perhaps 30 feet. She began moving down the slope. The snow was deep beyond reasonable expectation. On the exposed sections where the wind had been working it, 3 feet of compressed, dense snow that would bear her weight if she moved carefully and distributed her steps correctly, reading each surface before committing to it. In the sheltered sections, the hollows and lee sides of rock faces where the drift had been able to build it, was much deeper sometimes to her chest. And through these sections she moved differently, digging with her legs, using her arms for balance, making slow and exhausting progress in the way of someone who has been reduced to the single next movement and is sustaining that reduction indefinitely. She paid out the rope as she went. When it ran out, she tied it to one of the twisted pines she had been scavenging from a tree. She knew by feel and location. From there, she moved on memory and the grain of the wind and the slope of the ground. She was heading for Harlan Reed's farm. A mile of downhill travel, 20 minutes in normal conditions. She did not speculate about the time. The wind found gaps in her layering with a patience that matched its own description. Around the wrists, at the junction of scarf and hat, the small space at the base of her neck. Each gap was a steady drain of heat that she was managing, adjusting her pace to generate warmth at a rate that stayed ahead of the loss. She had been doing thermal calculations for months in the language of stone and earth and fire. This was the same calculation in a different medium. She fell 6 times. The first 2 were simple, surface gave way. She went sideways, came up immediately, continued. The third and fourth were drift sections that took her into mid-thigh and cost significant time and energy to extract herself from. The fifth was a wind-swept slope that had formed a surface like rough concrete, and she went down and slid and arrested herself against a rock she hadn't seen and sat against it for a moment, assessing, finding nothing broken getting up. The sixth was the worst. It was a drift section that looked like the others but wasn't deeper than anything she had encountered. And when she went in, she went to her armpits, and the snow was dense, and the angle was awkward. And for approximately 15 seconds, she was not sure she could get out. The snow pressed in from every side. Her arms were above it, and her legs were not moving the way they needed to move, and she was alone in a blizzard on a mountain in Montana. And she was very cold. She heard Gran Ruth's voice, not literally. It was her own internal voice in the register of something remembered, something carried for 20 years and available now when it was needed. You are made of the same patient material as the Earth Child, and the Earth does not stop. She got her arms positioned. She pushed. She worked one leg free, then the other, finding leverage in the packed snow itself, using its resistance against her the way she had learned to use stone's resistance as a fact to work with, rather than a force to fight. She came out of the drift by degrees slowly, and she kept moving. The barn appeared in the white like a darker shape within the general darkness of the storm, substantial and present enough to navigate toward. She moved toward it with the focused care of someone who knows that the end of a difficult journey is when you most need to be precise. The barn was intact, its roof holding. She moved around it to the house side. The farmhouse was standing, but the west-facing wall had sustained significant damage. A section of the upper exterior cladding had been peeled away by the wind, leaving the underlying frame exposed, the insulation batting visible and dark with moisture. The boards beneath flexing in the gusts, in a way that spoke of a structure being asked to do more than it was built for. Snow was getting into the wall assembly. In the third day of this temperature, that meant ice forming in the insulation. Thermal bridging heat leaking from the interior through that wall at a rate the fire inside could not fully replace. Through the downstairs windows, she could see firelight. Someone was there. She pushed through the drift to the front door and knocked. Knocked harder. Tried the handle unlocked, as doors in the Coldridge Valley outside of town were never locked during serious weather. because a locked door was a death sentence for someone who needed shelter. She pushed it open. Warmth hit her face first. Then the smell wood smoke and the underlaying smell of a house working hard. Pine resin burning fast, heat being generated, and immediately contested a fire doing its job at the edge of its capacity. Harlan Reed was sitting in the chair beside the wood stove in the particular posture of a man who has been in the same position for a very long time and has stopped trying to be comfortable and is simply maintaining. He was wearing his barn coat inside the house, 3 wool blankets around his shoulders. The stove was going, but the iron was not giving off the deep, saturated warmth it should have. It was working at the surface, not at mass, the heat of a fire being managed very carefully against a supply that was running low. He looked up when she came in, and his face did something she had not seen it do before. It went uncertain. Not surprise was in it. But that wasn't the primary thing. What his face did primarily was show uncertainty. The specific uncertainty of a very capable, very self-reliant man who has been in a situation for 3 days that his capability and self-reliance have not been fully adequate to manage, and who is confronted with evidence of this in the form of another person's presence in his house during a blizzard. He was uncertain the way stone is uncertain just before it finds the angle on the edge of something resolving. He said, "How?" One word. The economy of a man who has been sitting alone in a cold house for 3 days and has not been wasting his resources on words. Mara came inside and pushed the door closed behind her. Her hands were very cold. She held them near the stove and felt the heat move back into the fingers. The small, specific pain of circulation returning to chilled tissue. "How much wood do you have left?" she said. Harlan looked at her for a moment. "Day and a half, maybe 2 if I go careful." "The storm's breaking," she said. "Not done, but past its peak. Should be manageable by morning." He looked at her with the expression of a man receiving information he needs to believe, and is checking carefully before allowing himself to believe it. Then something in his face settled a tension she had not seen because it had been there the whole time, so constant it had been part of his resting expression. It released. "There's soup on the back of the stove," he said. "Been keeping." She found the pot. She found a second bowl. She ladled soup for both of them, and she sat down in the other chair, the one that had been his wife's, the one he had not sat in since before she died, the one he had been leaving open with the specific courtesy of a man who does not dramatize what he keeps. They sat by the stove and ate the soup. And outside, the storm worked at the house, and the house worked against the storm with its 3 decades of stubbornness, and Mara felt the warmth return to her body in layers working inward from the skin. The way all warming works from outside to inside, from surface to core. Harlan looked at the fire for a long time. Then he said, "Your place." She waited. "3rd day," he said. "Sitting here, watching the wood go down." He stopped. Reorganized. I kept telling myself it was a grave. Told myself that enough times it felt like fact. The same slow head shake from the first morning on the mountain, but carrying something entirely different in it now. Not skepticism, something closer to reckoning the specific quality of a man revising his accounting. What I kept thinking was, if it's a grave, you're dead. And if you're dead, why does it matter to me? But it did matter. He looked at her directly. I'd been leaving things at the bottom of the trail, which means some part of me already knew it wasn't a grave. It just took me 3 days of sitting here watching my wall come apart to catch up to what I already knew. Mara looked at the fire. "The rope and the lever," she said. "That was you." He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "It changed everything," she said. "The big stones. I couldn't have done the roof without it." He nodded, the nod of a man receiving information and placing it somewhere it will be useful, filing it rather than displaying it. They sat until the fire needed another log. Harlan added it with the careful hand of a man managing the last of a limited supply. Outside, the storm continued its work, with the diminished but still serious force of something that has spent 3 days at maximum and has not yet been told to stop. And somewhere under a half-mile of driven snow and mountain air in a room with earthen walls and a turf-covered stone roof, a candle burned on a table in the absolute stillness of the deep earth. Patient and unwavering, she stayed until morning. The storm broke in the pre-dawn hours with the specific abruptness that characterized its kind systems, that build slowly, sometimes end the same way, the wind stepping back from full force. In the space of an hour, the driven snow dropping to a vertical fall, the cloud cover thinning to reveal a colorless light that was not quite dawn and not quite dark, but the transition between them. She heard it happen from the chair beside Harlan's stove, where she had slept in 2-hour sections, waking each time the fire needed attention. She was aware, sleeping, of what the fire was doing and what the wood supply was. The way people who work close to their margins are always aware of the state of their resources, even while sleeping. When the light came, she went to the window. The snow had stopped. The wind was present but ordinary, the regular gray widow register the wind she knew. The sky was brightening in the east with the particular quality of light that follows serious weather, a cleanness that ordinary days don't achieve, as if the storm had scoured the air. The valley was buried, not covered, not blanketed, buried. The familiar landmarks had been erased or transformed beyond recognition. Fence lines invisible, the lower tree lines submerged, the road below visible only as a slightly different texture of white. The wind had built drifts in some places that reached 15-20 feet, and had scoured others down to thin, rippled surfaces. The average depth across the valley floor was 8 or 9 feet. On the exposed slopes above, considerably more. Harlan came and stood beside her at the window. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at what had been done. "We need to know about people," Harlan said. She nodded. "Before anything else. Before roads, before damage assessment. Before the practical accounting of what would need repair and what would need replacing. They needed to know about people. There were 15 farmsteads in the valley proper, and 6 more in the upper approaches, each of them containing a family that had been sitting inside this storm for 3 days with whatever wood they had and whatever structural integrity their walls had maintained. Harlan had a radio. He turned it on. The county emergency frequency was operational and organized the voice of a system that had been activated and was conducting itself with the grim efficiency of people who know the work is too large to afford wasted motion. Road closures, property damage assessments, requests for welfare checks on specific addresses, And then between two other items delivered in the same professional evenness as the road closure reports, a welfare check had been conducted that morning at a property on Glenwood Road, mile marker 7. The occupants, Earl and Dorothy Marsh. Earl 81, Dorothy 78 had been found. Their wood stove had gone out sometime in the second day of the storm. The county was handling the notifications. Harlan reached over and turned the volume down. Not off, down. He stood with his hand on the dial for a moment, and then moved it away and straightened up. And his face was the face of a man who has heard news that is not surprising, and is still, despite not being surprising, a blow. The specific blow of a world that follows its own logic, without regard for what you wish that logic would allow. Earl came to my wife's funeral, he said. Sat in the front row, didn't say a word. Just sat there. Mara didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would fit the shape of what Earl and Dorothy Marsh's last 2 days had been, nothing that would honor it without diminishing it. She kept quiet, and the quiet was the appropriate response. They went out 2 hours later. Harlan and 2 neighbors who arrived by snowshoe from the property to the east, and Mara. The neighbors were brothers the Aldridge men who had worked their family's place on that side of the valley since before they could remember, and who moved through the deep snow with the specific competence of people for whom difficult terrain is the baseline. They went out into the transformed white world and moved between the farmsteads in the order that their collective knowledge organized them, checking structures, confirming occupants, cataloging damage, with the systematic thoroughness of people who know that thorough is the only way to do this. 3 roofs had partially collapsed, 2 barns and a storage shed. 1 farmhouse on the north side of the valley had sustained wall damage comparable to what Mara had seen at Harlan's, and the family inside had been managing 2 days with inadequate heat. Various stages of cold exposure, none of it severe, all of it miserable and frightening. They brought that family out and took them to Harlan's, which was the nearest intact heated structure with a functioning stove. By mid-morning, the word was moving through the valley, the way word moves in a rural community after something serious on foot, and by radio, and by the fact of people going out to find other people. Because after 3 days of isolation, the human instinct is toward contact, toward the confirmation that the community has come through this as a community, and not only as isolated individuals who happen to be in proximity. By early afternoon, 9 people were sitting around Harlan Reed's kitchen table. Harlan stood at the head of it. He had not planned what he was going to say. It was not the kind of thing you planned. He said it the way he said most things of importance, directly, without softening, as a report of what he had observed and now needed to convey. There's a woman on that mountain, he said, who went through this storm in better shape than any structure in this valley. I was sitting in this house, burning my last wood, watching my wall come apart. And she was comfortable. He let that word do its work for a moment. Comfortable. I want you to understand what I mean by that. 3 days of what we just had wind we haven't seen in 20 years snowfall. That's going to be in the record books. And she was comfortable, warm, eating soup, reading. The kitchen held this. I told her she was digging a grave, Cecilia, he said. Said it to her face. And I kept bringing her food every week because I felt bad about saying it, and because I didn't believe it quite enough to stop. A pause. Turned out I was right not to believe it. What she built up there is not a grave. What she built up there is the only structure in this valley that the storm couldn't get into. One of the people at the table was a man named Beckett, a broad, deliberate man in his 50s who ran a cattle operation up the East Canyon, who had grown up in this valley and knew its land with the specific familiarity of someone who has worked it his whole life. He said, "The hollow on Goat's Folly, she built into the slope, Harlan said. Earth walls on 3 sides and back, stone roof covered with turf. The ground itself is the insulation. You dig deep enough, the earth holds heat all winter. Doesn't matter what the surface does." Beckett was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather used to talk about root cellars, how they stayed the same temperature year-round." "Same principle," Harlan said. She took it further. "Build a room to live in, not just to store food. Small stove for cooking, but the earth does most of the work." Another person at the table was a woman named Pratt, a school teacher in Coldridge, sharp-minded and practical, who had a homestead on the valley's south side that she had managed alone for 15 years since her husband moved to Billings, and she had decided without particular drama that she preferred the valley. She said, "How long did it take to build?" Harlan looked at Mara. Everyone at the table looked at Mara. She was sitting at the far end, her hands around a coffee cup. She had been listening to Harlan describe her work with the same attentiveness she brought to everything fully present, not performing anything simply there. She had spent the past 6 weeks being looked at and speculated about, and the accumulation of it had made her very still in public spaces, comfortable with being observed without feeling required to respond to the observation. 6 weeks, she said. "Alone," Pratt said. "Alone." Mara said. The kitchen held this for a moment that had a specific quality, the quality of a room full of practical people encountering a fact they have to reorganize their assumptions to contain. A man named Dowd, who had come with the group from the east side of the valley, who had farmed his family's land for 4 decades, with the kind of quiet competence that never called attention to itself, said what everyone else was thinking, but framing more carefully. "And Archer Holt's been going around saying you were out of your mind. Dangerous even." The kitchen went a different kind of quiet. Mara held her coffee cup. She thought about Archer's face in Patrice's front parlor, the arranged concern, and the eyes already on the mountain. She thought about what it had cost to work through the social isolation, the same way she had worked through the physical isolation, by letting the work speak, by refusing to defend herself with words when the work would eventually say it better. "Archer had reasons of his own for wanting me off that land," she said. "They were his reasons. They weren't reasons about me." Harlan said, "Archer Holt told people in this valley that you were a danger to yourself and to others. He was working the community against you." He said it flatly, as information, not as drama. He was wrong, and he was wrong out loud to a lot of people. That has consequences. Beckett looked at his large hands on the table. 3 of the buildings that came through worst are going to need rebuilding before next winter. Earl Marsh's place is going to sit empty. He paused. People are going to be thinking about how they build. "Should be," Dowd said. Pratt looked at Mara with the direct gaze of a practical person who has identified a solution and wants to know its dimensions. Is there a way to do what you did for a family? More than one room with proper light and a real floor. Mara had been thinking about this for 6 weeks. Not because she had anticipated this conversation. She had been too disciplined about the arithmetic of her own situation to spend resources on speculation. But because the problem interested her, the way problems interest people who have solved a hard version of one and can feel the shape of the easier versions that surround it. Yes, she said. The principle scales. The challenge is the roof the stone slab method I used is slow and requires the right geology. But there are timber approaches, proper framing over an earth-covered roof that work with purchased materials. The excavation is labor, a great deal of labor. But labor is the one thing this valley has. Beckett looked at her with the expression she would come to know well. Over the following months, the expression of a person encountering a practical solution and rapidly reorganizing his understanding to accommodate it. "Show me," he said. She showed him. 2 days after the storm broke, when the county roads had been cleared enough for vehicle access, Harlan Reed led a procession up the trail to Goats Hollow. 12 people in total climbing through deep snow on a path that demanded effort from all of them, drawn by something they had heard and needed to see before they could fully believe. They came one after another, pulling themselves up through the drifts with the determination of people who understand that seeing is different from being told, and that what they would see was worth the effort of getting there. They gathered at the entrance to Mara's home, and they were quiet. She let them look. She had learned the value of letting silence do what words couldn't, of allowing evidence to make its own argument. The structure spoke for itself. The way the turf roof had accepted the weight of 6 feet of storm snow and was holding it without distress. The load distributed across the stone slabs beneath with the indifferent competence of engineering that matches the forces applied to it. The way the front stone face had not moved. The way the entrance which she had cleared that morning led into a darkness that was even from the threshold not as dark as it should have been. There was a quality of habitation to it, of warmth, that the exterior gave no reason to expect. She invited them in a few at a time because the room was small, and because she wanted each group to have the full experience of the transition outside to inside, exposed to sheltered cold, to neutral, without the dilution that too many people at once would produce. They went through the low doorway and straightened up inside, and stood in the earth-walled room and breathed the air and felt what the air was still neutral. The maintained temperature of the deep ground, the warmth that the earth had stored through all the cold months and held without effort, without fire, without any of the apparatus that the valley's other structures required to do a version of the same thing and did it less well. Most of them were quiet for a long time. Beckett ran his hand along the rear earthen wall and said, "It's warm. The wall itself is warm." "The earth is warm," Mara said. "The wall is just where the earth starts." He looked at his hand against the wall at the specific quality of the warmth moving into his palm. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man adding something to his accounting. Pratt stood in the center of the room and turned around once, taking it all in. And then she looked at Mara and said, "My daughter's family lost their house. The south wall came in on the 2nd day. They're staying with my sister in town right now." She paused. "Could you help us build them something like this?" The question was simple. It did not contain the architectural complexity of what she was asking, did not acknowledge the labor involved or the months required or the gap between. what Mara had done alone in 6 weeks, and what a family home would need. It was the question of a mother looking at a solution and asking if the solution could be applied to her problem. Yes, Mara said. Archer Holt was there. He had come with the group, which she had not expected, but on reflection should have. He was too smart to be absent from a moment this public. He stood at the back of the gathering outside the entrance, and he watched what happened with his neighbors. And he watched Mara answer their questions, and he watched Harlan Reed stand beside her with the posture of a man who has changed his position on something and sees no reason to be embarrassed about having changed it. When Beckett said in front of the group what Harlan had said inside his kitchen, that Mara Holt had built the only structure in the valley that the storm couldn't get into, and that Archer Holt had been telling people she was dangerous, when what she actually was right. Archer started to speak. He got 3 words out before Harlan Reed said, "Don't." He said it quietly, without emphasis, without the weight of drama. The way you say something when you mean it completely and have no interest in elaborating. Archer stopped. He looked at the 12 people standing on the mountain around him and saw in their faces a collection of expressions that shared a common element. They had already decided something, and the something was not in his favor. He saw this clearly. Archer was a man who read situations accurately. It was one of his genuine skills, and he read this one accurately now. He closed his mouth. He turned. He went back down the mountain alone at the pace of a man accounting for a significant loss, which was exactly what he was doing. No one watched him go. They were watching Mara show them the stove. She showed them the chimney construction and how she had packed the flue pipe gap with clay. She showed them the drainage management in the front wall. She showed them the way she had fitted the door frame and insulated it. She explained the principle of thermal bridging and air infiltration in the language of a person who had learned these things not from textbooks, but from the direct physical experience of what happened when she got them wrong. From the drafts that had found the gaps in her first door fitting from the moisture that had appeared in the wall where she had missed a clay packing from every error that the structure had honestly reported, and that she had gone back and corrected. She was not a teacher by training. She discovered that day that she was one by inclination, that the translation of hard-won understanding into language that other people could use was something she could do with the same patience and precision she had brought to the physical work itself. She answered every question. When she didn't know the answer, she said so, and said what she did know, and said how she would find out the rest. Pratt, going back down the mountain in the afternoon, walked beside her for a portion of the trail and said, "Goat's Hollow. People in this valley have been calling it that since before my father was born, as a joke mostly." Mara looked up the slope toward her home, which had already been absorbed back into the hillside, already indistinguishable from the natural fold of the land, unless you knew exactly where to look. "It's a good hollow," she said. They built Pratt's daughter's home the following spring. It was a different kind of construction from what Mara had done. More people, more materials, the coordination of multiple opinions and multiple skills being its own distinct kind of labor. But the principle was the same. The excavation went into the south-facing slope behind the property. The walls were timber-framed and earth-banked. The roof was proper timber beams with compacted soil and sod over them, built over a long weekend by 8 people working together in the old way. The way the valley had worked together for barn raisins and harvest, and the collective tasks that individual effort could not accomplish. Mara worked alongside them every day. She answered questions. She caught mistakes before they became problems. She stood in the excavation on the third day and pressed her palm to the earthen wall at the depth they had reached, and said to Beckett's son, a 16-year-old who had been hauling and digging for 3 days, with the uncomplaining stamina of the young, "Feel this." The boy put his hand against the wall. His face changed in the specific way that faces change when physical evidence confirms something that was previously only a concept, the moment when the abstract becomes real, and the real becomes something you carry in your hands, rather than only in your head. "It's warm," he said. "It's been warm since before your grandfather was born," Mara said. "It'll be warm when your grandchildren are grown. The earth doesn't forget the warmth it borrowed from the sun." He looked at his hand against the wall for a long moment. Then Harlan Reed's voice came from the excavation's edge asking about the roof beam spacing, and Mara went back to work. 3 families built earth-sheltered homes in the Coldridge Valley that summer. The following summer, 4 more. Mara designed each one differently. Different slope aspects, different soil profiles, different structural approaches that the specific geology of each site required. And the designing was as satisfying as the building had been carried the same quality of problem solving that was grounded in physical reality, rather than abstraction, that had consequences you could measure and walk into and live inside. She was never lonely again. She had not expected this. She had not built toward it. She had built toward surviving a winter, toward having something that was genuinely hers, toward not being dependent on other people's charity and other people's stories about who she was. The community had arrived as a consequence of something else, not as a goal in itself. It had arrived because she had done something useful, and useful things attract the people who need them, which is eventually everyone. Harlan Reed came up the mountain every week now, not with the mule, not with offerings, openly, directly walking the trail that he had come to know as well as his own fence lines. He arrived at the same time on the same morning every week, with the consistency that was his primary mode of caring about things, and he did not reevaluate the decision each time he made it, because the decision had been made, and he was not a man who revisited settled accounts. He came and they drank coffee and talked about the problems of the structures being built in the valley, the engineering questions, the material questions, the particular challenges each new site presented. And sometimes they talked about his wife who had been dead for 3 years and who was still present in the way that people who have been fully and genuinely known remain present in the people who knew them. Her handwriting on a jar of beans, her chair that had been offered without ceremony. Mara thought about Gran Ruth often the way she thought about all the things she had been given, in forms she hadn't recognized as gifts at the time. The dead husband's worthless land, the collapsed stone shelter, the poverty that had stripped away every conventional option and left her with only the earth itself, and the memory of an old woman's voice by a wood stove saying the mountain never forgets the warmth it borrowed from the sun. Each of these had been an inheritance shaped like an insult. Each of them had been the angle she needed. She had just had to find it. She thought desperation is not the opposite of wisdom. Sometimes it is the precondition of it. Sometimes the only way to find the angle is to be stripped of everything else first. to be left with the material itself, stone and earth and the cold, and the question, what does this want to do if you give it half a chance? The story of that first winter traveled through the valley and beyond. It carried by the people who had stood in the room and felt the warm air and seen the unmoving candle flame, carried by the builders who had learned the technique and lived in the results, carried by the structures themselves, the green turf roofs that dotted the Coldridge slopes, the low, stone-faced entrances that looked like natural features from a distance, the homes that sat inside the mountain rather than on top of it, warm through everything the Gray Widow could produce, requiring a fraction of the fuel that the conventional houses required, silent inside, while the wind worked at the world outside. It became a story told to children, because that was where the most important knowledge ended up, in stories told by firelight on cold nights, carried in the form that best preserved it through time. Stories had people in them, and people made things real in a way that principles and instructions could not. And real things were remembered when abstract things were not. The story they told was about a woman who had arrived on a mountain with nothing and had found in the nothing everything she needed, who had been told the land was worthless and had found it was full of what she needed most, who had dug a grave and discovered it was a home, who had listened when no one else was listening to something the mountain had been saying for longer than anyone had been alive to hear it. They told it as a story about looking at what you have rather than what you lack, about the difference between a problem and a starting point, about the knowledge that lives in the hands of old people and the bones of mountains and the patience of the earth, which does not hurry and does not forget. And in the house on Goat's Hollow on the winter nights, when the Gray Widow came down from the northern peaks and worked over Coldridge Valley with its old, relentless, indifferent force, a candle burned on a table in a room that the storm could not reach. The flame rose straight. It did not bend. It burned with the clean, vertical confidence of a thing that has found a place that will hold it, that has been given shelter by the oldest insulation in the world, by the earth itself, which does not forget the warmth it was given, which holds the summer in its bones through all the long dark of the winter, which keeps its secret faithfully until the right person kneels down in the wind and presses a cheek to a cold stone and finally listens.